I would like to invite you to join us for our ICF virtual conference called The Voyage Continues, July 23 through 25 later this summer, beginning at 6 p.m. London time each day. Friday will be devoted to our commemoration of the voyage of the Mayflower 400 years ago. Saturday will be devoted to other Mayflower stories. How did Congregationalism come to the various parts of the world outside of Britain and the United States? Sunday will be devoted to COVID stories from our churches around the world and a collective worship service reaching all the way around the globe. I hope you will be able to join us. To register for this free conference, please go to www.theicf.org.
Hello everyone, I'm Janet Wootton, co-chair of the International Congregational Theological Commission, and I'm interviewing Joseph Nockels, one of the speakers at the conference of the International Congregational Fellowship on the 23rd to the 25th of July this year. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Janet.
Could you introduce yourself and tell us how you come to have an interest in the Mayflower Pilgrims?
Sure, I'm a PhD researcher currently at the National Library of Scotland and at the University of Edinburgh, and we're focusing currently on how both institutions can use digital methods in making their historical collections more accessible to users. I'm a trained archivist, and whilst my work now touches many periods and many themes, I came to the discipline through studying the Pilgrims, and especially their stint in the Dutch city of Leiden whilst attending Leiden University. And during that work, I was funded by the unaffiliated Congregational Churches Charities in the UK to carry out a broad survey of how life was lived in the early 17th century in the city by the Pilgrims. And they came to the city after fleeing persecution in England, and they stayed from roughly 1609 to 1620, and after which about a third of that original group then sailed to Virginia to found Plymouth and enact the bit of the story that most people are familiar with. In terms of my interest in the Pilgrims, I was primarily interested with their story as almost a heritage battleground of sorts. The story has been pulled and prodded in so many different directions by certain communities attempting to anchor themselves to that Mayflower story to gain relevance in society and worth. And it was that discussion, that heritage discussion, that I was really interested in. And part of that was how the modern Protestant church has been part of reshaping the Pilgrim story. We've been talking to Peggy Bendroth as part of this series in the build-up to the ICF conference, and in her book, which is called The Last Puritans, Mainland Protestants and the Power of the Past, she talks about how the modern Protestant church has used the Pilgrims as a device to present their worth to society at a time when they're rapidly declining in the UK and the US. And I was really interested in that side of the Pilgrims, how they've been treated as a special and really venerated, and their principles and ideals treasured without criticism. And it's only really now that archivists and historians are beginning to question that actually and unpick the story. So that's how I came to the Pilgrims as a research interest.
It sounds as though you've got exactly the background and experience and the interest to make you a brilliant speaker for this conference that's coming up. And you're speaking on the Leiden experience. In your paper, you say that history is often a composite story of individuals, not a collection of sweeping themes, and that the Mayflower story in particular is set against a background of a chaos of competing polities in England, where the Pilgrims came from, and a melting pot of religious movements in the Netherlands, which was their first place of escape. So you approach the events of the time through the stories of individuals caught up in the chaos of events. Why did you choose that approach, and what do you get out of it?
It's a really, really good question, Janet. And just for a bit of background, my talk at ICF is going to look at 4 primary pilgrims, some of which attendees might be aware of, like William Bradford and William Brewster, and others who've been traditionally neglected by the heritage discourse, as I talked about, like the female pilgrims and Sarah Minter, who was midwife to the pilgrims whilst they were in Leiden, especially. And as you said, you know, the pilgrim story in Leiden, in England, and in Plymouth all occurs against the backdrop of this huge political upheaval and civil conflict that's happening in the early 17th century, mainly as a result of criticism of James I and the established church, and how worship should be conducted, and how regimented that should be, and what, you know, the end result of which relates to what was the worth of the individual in the congregation and what say were they allowed, which then has led us to modern day congregationalism and the church structures we're familiar with and the churches we attend nowadays. And so I took this approach to look at individuals for various reasons. Among historians, there's a huge trend now to look at bottom-up histories, to look at local communities first and then construct narratives, as that's sometimes a bit more representative. And in the Pilgrims' case, this really helps with breaking down the familiar motifs and images we have of the Pilgrims as having buckles on their shoes, dressing in black and white, having starched bonnets and pointy hats, and reveals really a true essence of how the Pilgrims operated, what they thought, how they did present themselves. And that means that we can move beyond this image that's really been sold to us in various ways with various motives, some quite negative, which the talk will go into. So that was one reason for pursuing individual histories. Another, like I mentioned, was just to elevate the stories of the neglected, moving beyond the kind of well-known constructions that we have. And you talked about, at least whilst they were in Leiden, the fact that the Pilgrims actually integrated themselves and assimilated within the city, which we often neglect. So although the Pilgrims decided amongst themselves that they would have these strict boundaries between them and other communities to, you know, remain pure, to really kind of keep security as well. A lot of them started attending other places of worship, often if they knew a bit of Dutch, with Dutch congregations. A lot of them attended kind of betrothal ceremonies with those who were from other communities. A lot of them ran errands for other religious groups. In one case, the minister of the English Reformed Church, which was quite similar but was actually backed by the state, went about working out the kind of land sales and property sales of the Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims did the same. So actually kind of almost acting as modern day estate agents of sorts. So although we might see in normal histories that these groups proclaimed that they wouldn't interact with each other too greatly, if you break it down to individual stories, they really did. And there's a huge kind of tapestry of connections that are happening there. So yeah, my talk attempts to move away from the kind of overly selective view that we have of the Pilgrims to hopefully a vivid depiction of what life on the ground was like in the 17th century Dutch Republic. And through that, we can dispel these heritage that we've kind of come to know, and these claims making devices that we've constructed for ourselves as well.